From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Most studies indicate greater production and better pasture utilization are achieved when sheep and cattle or sheep, cattle, and goats are grazed together as opposed to grazing only sheep, goats, or cattle alone. K-State Beef Systems Extension Specialist Jayme Lynn Farney explored co-species grazing on a recent Dr. J's Beef podcast with K-State's Dr. Alison Crane, a sheep and goat specialist. We'll take an extended look at the benefits that sheep and goats offer beef cattle producers. Also, K-State horticulturist Ward Upham covers planting spring flowering bulbs, controlling broadleaf weeds in lawns, and applying late-season nitrogen to cool-season lawns. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is Agriculture Today. Grazing a pasture with more than one species of animal offers several advantages, and that's the focus of a recent Dr. J's Beef podcast with Beef Systems Extension Specialist for Northeast Kansas, Jayme Lynn Farney, and Dr. Alison Crane, a K-State sheep and goat specialist. Crane says that sheep and goats can have a major impact on grazing-type operations.
One of the biggest ones, especially if we're talking about eastern central Kansas, is we can increase the amount of plant diversity, especially in native pastures. And we can increase pasture utilization. But also, people are always really concerned with parasite loads. When we talk about co-species grazing, it shouldn't be as big of a concern as what people typically think about. One of the other things is if we're talking about splitting up pastures and doing a more rotational type system, which is typically what we do when we're incorporating co-species grazing into a system, the smaller the paddocks that we can incorporate, which of course is going to increase the amount of fencing, which is one of the drawbacks of a co-species type system. But the smaller the paddock we have or pasture that we have, the better those impacts, the bigger those impacts will be when we start incorporating sheep or goats, just because we have more control over that pasture system and more utilization of those grasses and forbs that we have in our pastures. So we're going to have better utilization overall. And one of the other big things is an extended grazing season. That's going to be one of the biggest things for your operation, because of course that's going to decrease your cost overall. But because of incorporating these other species and having better utilization, we actually can see increased average daily gains, increased gains per acre, and actually improved stocking rates, because you're incorporating more species and able to actually typically double, triple stock based on those other species compared to just grazing cattle alone.
And you'd mentioned rotational grazing, and that had piqued my interest because I hadn't necessarily heard that. When we typically think on the cattle side, rotational grazing, the cattle move to each paddock. When you incorporate, say, small ruminants, sheep or goats in there, are you rotating them in the same pastures with your cattle, or is this maybe you have two different rotational systems, the sheep go through first and the cattle second? Or just to explain that a little more, please.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different options when it comes to any type of controlled grazing system. But one of the, I guess, more common types of grazing system, controlled grazing system, is rotational grazing. But we have a lot of different options within that as well. So we can rotate cattle with the sheep or with the goats and keep them all in the same pastures. So rotating them together, which can be very beneficial when it comes to some of the drawbacks of incorporating sheep or goats into your operation, like predators. It's usually a big concern depending on your operation for the sheep and goat side of things. But if you can get the sheep or the goats bonded to the cattle, you actually won't run into a lot of your predator issues because they tend to stick with the cattle. So when you're rotating them together, that's an added benefit. But I know there's a lot of people that are concerned, or they just don't want to graze the cattle and the sheep or cattle and goats together at the same time, especially if on the back burner in their head. They're really still concerned about parasite loads. You can always graze either the cattle in front of the sheep, so rotating the sheep into a paddock once the cattle have hit that paddock, or doing it in front of the cattle, which most people aren't going to do because they're more concerned about the cattle getting the grasses. And so if it was me personally, I would either graze them together or I would graze the goats or the sheep in behind the cattle, because sheep and goats are typically going to be incorporated into a cattle operation because there's some undesirable species of grass or forbs existing in that grazing system. And they're going to be able to target that. And then in order to force them to target that species, you're going to do that much more successfully if the cattle have already come through and that's one of the only species left for those sheep or goats to graze. So cerisa is, of course, a big topic in Kansas, popular species to target graze, and sheep and goats, especially goats, are going to more heavily utilize that pasture than, of course, cattle, but sheep as well.
Thanks for walking through that. I was thinking, you might want to run the sheep and goats through first so they'll eat your forbs out of the way, so then your cattle don't have to worry and eat your grass. But I know that sheep in particular, they can potentially go after that good grass that your cattle do as well and maybe graze it. So that makes a lot of sense if you don't want to graze them at the same time, following your cattle with the sheep and goats.
Yeah, so I always explain it of cattle are going to be your pickiest eaters. And it can be dependent on breed of cattle, and just as the same with breeds of sheep and breeds of goats. There's a whole array of pickiness within the different species, but cattle by far are going to be the pickiest species when we're narrowing it down to these three species that we're talking about. But they're going to be the pickiest. They're always going to tend to go after the grass unless there's one particular type of forb that is in a peak season where it's going to be like candy to them, which then if they target that, there's still this whole array of other plants that the sheep or the goats are going to go after anyway. And you're just doing a better job of forcing them to utilize those more undesirable, unpalatable grasses or forbs that won't be as desirable to cattle.
Now, this is a beef podcast, and so we're really always talking about beef as one of the species in this co-species mix. And you've talked about sheep and goats. Is there a certain species that is better to graze in conjunction with cattle? And you can even throw in different ones. I've heard about horses or llamas or something might be other options.
Yeah, so horses, the main issue with horses is depending on our stocking rates, we can have a little bit more of an overgrazing issue with horses just because they are really going to love grasses as well. And they're going to graze down low, especially depending on how many horses are in the pasture. They tend to be a lot harsher on our grass pastures compared to cattle, sheep, and goats. So that's one of my main concerns with grazing, especially too many horses alongside cattle, because they have a lot of crossover with what they tend to identify as desirable forage. When we talk about sheep and goats, of course, that crossover is a lot less. There is some overlap, a lot more overlap of sheep and cattle. But of course, sheep are going to tend to eat those forbs more than cattle. And then they will still browse quite a bit, especially if we're grazing hair sheep with cattle. But if we're talking about minimum crossover of grazing, goats are really our ideal species, especially if we need brush control or any type of brush management, because goats, I would say goats are like deer. And we actually there's some research out there, there's some numbers of percentages of what type of forage they're going to utilize. And they actually almost completely line up with a white-tailed deer as far as grazing behavior. So I don't know, most people that are grazing cattle probably have a lot of deer on their pastures too, and you probably see a minimal impact on your pasture as far as the cattle utilizing forage when there's deer on the pasture. And so it's going to be really similar to the goats. But once again, the main issue with incorporating goats into an operation is fencing. You do have to do a lot of improved fencing compared to cattle. 5-strand barbed wire is not going to do a great job of keeping goats in. Now, if you have a lot of feed, a lot of desirable feed forage within those fences, they're going to do a much better job. But as soon as they get bored or something else on the other side of the fence interests them, they're through the fence. So most of the time when people are starting to jog the idea of incorporating another species into their grazing system, it's going to be sheep. Wool sheep do a really nice job of staying in a 5-strand barbed wire fence, especially if they're already used to that type of fencing. And if there's a lot of feed available within the fence, usually you have minimal issues with just that cattle fencing. When we talk about hair sheep, they're going to be able to get through a fence a little bit better. But once again, if they're bonded to the cattle and there's lots of forage availability within that fence, even the hair sheep are going to do a really nice job of being incorporated into that cattle grazing system. And sometimes all you have to do is just add another bottom strand of barbed wire, and you're good.
And I'm going to put you on the spot. What about within the goat species? Are there certain ones that are better for certain objectives, especially in this co-species grazing?
Yeah, so the way that the boar breed of goat has been developed in the U.S., they tend to be less parasite resistant, number one, than other breeds of goats. And they tend to not be as browsy or less prone to browsing than other species of goats. It makes sense. I mean, they're a heavy muscled goat. They need more inputs. So they're going to be less of the browsing, more of the forb oriented type animal. And we actually did some co-species grazing here at the unit this summer. And we have very heavily boar influenced goats. And when forced, they utilize the pasture, utilize that browse very well still. But you have to be willing to force them to do that. And this was all mature does. But ideally, any type of Spanish influenced goat or even the Kikos do a really nice job, but more of those less heavy muscled type meat goat do a really nice job. But the Spanish, by far, they're super hardy goats. Their nickname is brush goats. So there's a reason for that. I mean, you can just turn them loose and try and round them up the next year, and most of the time they'll all still be alive because they're just very resilient, hardy animals.
That's K-State Beef System Specialist for Southeast Kansas, Jayme Lynn Farney, and K-State Sheep and Goat Specialist, Dr. Alison Crane. When Agriculture Today continues after the break, they'll focus on balancing stocking rates to avoid overgrazing. Stay with us on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, Amber Alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues with more of our extended look at co-species grazing with Beef Systems Extension Specialist for Southeast Kansas, Jayme Lynn Farney, and Dr. Alison Crane, a K-State Sheep and Goat Specialist. Crane says that producers worried about overgrazing can balance stocking rates to prevent that from occurring.
Now, you'd mentioned several times, and as beef producers, we really worry about overgrazing. And most of the time, we're looking to add sheep and goats in for a pasture management component. How do you balance those multiple animals for a stocking rate or stocking intensity perspective?
If you are currently not in an overgrazing situation with your cattle grazing system, the general rule is that you can run 5 sheep per cow-calf unit. So 5 sheep to every pair and 6 goats to every pair. Depending on where you're at in Kansas, that of course will be adjusted, but of course you're adjusting your cattle grazing units then as well. But I know people north of Manhattan, I said a 6-to-1 ratio of goats, and they all laughed at me, and they're like, oh, we're doing 8-to-1 and we still have plenty of grass. So of course that was on a wetter year. And of course that's all going to change. So if you are a superior grazing manager with your cattle, then using your same monitoring system that you have in place for your cattle and being able to make those adjustments depending on weather and everything, of course, is going to be key. So I would say if you are already a superior grazing manager, still use those same rules of thumb. So start with that 5-to-1 ratio or 6-to-1 ratio, depending on if it's sheep or goats, and then use your monitoring system to make adjustments from there. But if you aren't in that situation, some really great rules of thumb that will prevent some parasite issues also in cattle too. But when we talk about incorporating sheep and goats, we really don't want to graze below 4 inches of height or 4 inches of stubble. And that's our minimum. So ideally, it's not below 5 inches. And that's because most of our parasites, when they're starting to mature, they're going up the stalk of a plant, grass plant, and they don't typically go above that 4-inch mark. So if we can not graze below that, then we're reducing the amount of parasites that our sheep, goats, cattle are being exposed to. So ideally, not below 5 inches. If you can leave it at 6 inches, that's even better. And there's some species of grass that if we get below that, we're harming the grass. And that's going to be true for a lot of grasses, that 4-inch mark. But some of our other grasses are going to be even more sensitive. Some of them are going to be more that 6 to 8 inch mark, and it's not a parasite issue, it's a grass issue. Some of those grasses are in Kansas, but they're very few and far between. You want to also leave at least 2 leaflets on that stalk of grass, because to improve, and this is very true for a rotational grazing system, if you're going to come back to that pasture, you have to leave something for that piece of grass, that blade of grass, to actually regenerate and regrow, because you're going to come back to it. You want there to be grass when you come back. And in order for that to happen, that plant has to undergo photosynthesis again to keep growing. They need leaves to do that. So if you graze down below all of the leaflets in that grass pasture, you won't have any regeneration. You've just killed off that pasture. That's a good rule of thumb, is to leave at least 2 blades, leaflets, however you want to call them, for that regeneration to take place. The other thing is you can increase your stocking rates by up to 25% when you are doing this, like I said before. And so I think that's something that people miss out on. You get very caught up in the concerns of implementing these, but we actually can add a lot of value to the operation.
And you don't see that 25% increase in stocking rate that first year. Would you start by increasing your rates that first year or build up?
I would definitely build up. So I would start very small, just because one of the other big concerns is when you're used to cattle and used to managing cattle, sheep and goats can be very different. I tell my students that sheep and goats, you have to remember, because everyone just thinks they're dumb. But the reason people think that is because they're not used to observing them. And that's another great thing about these rotational grazing, controlled grazing systems. You're actually overly managing these animals, because you're going out and you're moving, whether it's strip grazing and you're moving a fence every few days, or you're rotating them through fences every few days. You're seeing those animals a lot more often. And so that's going to help you become a better manager.
And you've mentioned several different times about the parasite load, and that's kind of the number one.
Yeah.
Is there any other health concerns with your multi-species?
So, of course, there's some zoonotic diseases, especially if we're talking about breeding season. So learning how to identify some of the chlamydia. Our Campylobacter is actually a different variety. So that's typically not going to be a concern. And even on the parasite topic, because that's usually people's number one concern, the gastrointestinal parasites that we see in sheep and goats cannot live in any species of cattle. They can't live there, and vice versa, unless we're talking about calves. That is the only time that we see any crossover or any naivety in any variety of cattle. And so if you do have young calves on pasture, they're still nursing, then in that case, I would definitely be running the sheep or goats in behind cattle, especially if your sheep and goats they don't have lambs or kids on their side. In that scenario, I'd definitely be running the sheep and the goats behind the cattle, so that those calves aren't being exposed to those parasites, because you don't want to run into that issue. But other than that scenario, there's no crossover between parasites. And so it's actually a great dead-end system for parasites if you are concerned, or if you have an existing issue on pasture with some of your parasites. So we can actually decrease the amount of threatening parasites by co-species grazing.
That is great news. And that's most researchers that I've seen find that. That's a great way to stop transmission for both species.
Yes.
And the last question I have for you, aside from the fencing that you've already touched on, are there other infrastructure changes that a cattle producer needs to implement with this co-species grazing?
So the biggest thing that most people are going to worry about, besides the fencing and besides the parasites, is going to be that predator issue. And of course, we can implement dogs, burrows. And so for most people, if you're wanting to do minimal inputs, you're not going to want to do dogs because you're still going to have to feed the dogs, even though they're awesome as far as guard animals go. But llamas, burros, of course, they're going to be also utilizing the pasture. And so if you want to incorporate another animal into your grazing system, they're going to fit into that very nicely as well. But like I said, you can also bond the sheep or the goats to cattle, and that can take a little bit, but usually doesn't take more than a couple of months, maybe one grazing season, and they'll get bonded, especially when forced to bond. I always say be patient, give them a little bit of time, expect a little bit of loss, but it's not going to be anything detrimental to the operation. But other than that, yeah, fencing is the main infrastructure issue. I know plenty of sheep people that are running sheep when they need to work them through cattle chutes. Cattle tubs still work great for sheep and for goats too. Goats are a little more wily, but I mean, we have temporary panels that we can set up and tear down, and we use bud box systems for working our sheep and our goats. You can be as minimal as you want, and then figure out the parts that are frustrating within your working system, and then figure out modifications from there. I would discourage people from going out and spending a lot of money to incorporate sheep or goats into a grazing system. I would say the number one concern, if you're going to go out and spend money, spend it on the fence, because that's going to be the most frustrating part of that entire system, is just getting them to stay in and do what you want to do. And if you're going to do strip grazing, as far as controlled grazing, definitely purchasing temporary fencing, whether that's electric tape fence or the electric net wire, can be a lifesaver, especially if you have some of those species of grasses forage that we're not wanting and that we want to target graze. Being able to just fence in that area and put goats or sheep into that area is an extremely powerful tool. So yeah, you get a little bit of cost with it, but hopefully in a year, 2 years of grazing that, you're actually going to get more desirable grass species coming back in that area.
Oh, and we almost forgot our public broadcast notice. Can you put out the same mineral for cattle as you do for sheep?
I preach that all the time. So no, that is really our only negative thing about grazing sheep with cattle is if you want to kill some sheep, have them cattle mineral. And also, if you're supplementing cattle on pasture and that supplement has rumensin in it at the cattle dose, that's another great way to kill some sheep and goats. They can eat rumensin, but it's at a lower dosage rate. So rumensin kills sheep and goats, and copper. So we want to make sure that we're using the mineral that is intended for that species in that pasture. The goats are going to be a lot more tolerant to those copper levels in the cattle feeds, cattle mineral, but still I encourage people to use goat mineral. I know for us here with a lot of the students, for a while I didn't even buy goat mineral because you can kill sheep with goat mineral. So it's really important not even to use goat mineral for the sheep because, like I said, the goats need more copper too in their diet. So really the number one thing is if you're feeding sheep, use sheep mineral.
That's K-State Beef System Specialist for Southeast Kansas, Jayme Lynn Farney, and K-State Sheep and Goat Specialist, Dr. Alison Crane, a recent guest on Dr. J's Beef Podcast. A link to that podcast is available on the Southeast Research and Extension Center website. This is Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wickman. In today's agricultural news, dryness continues to be the main story with the nation's topsoil moisture. USDA's Stephanie Ho has more with USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
As far as topsoil moisture is concerned, dryness continues to be the big story.
If you look from the plain states westward, all but 2 showing topsoil moisture rated at least 65% very short to short.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says there are states where topsoil moisture shortages surpass 80%.
Led by New Mexico at 92%. Other states in that 80% plus category are Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, and that is showing just some of the real concerns for the winter wheat crop across the central and southern Great Plains, as well as the continuing wildfire danger.
Meanwhile, in the Midwest and Northeast,
some of those areas have received precipitation, but as of October 18th, we still saw topsoil moisture 74% short to very short in Indiana, and in the Northeast, New Hampshire led 92% very short to short.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Well, musk thistle is one of 12 statewide noxious weeds in Kansas, infesting over 700,000 acres. It's been reported in nearly every county in Kansas and is found primarily in pastures, rangeland, hay meadows, alfalfa, fallow, roadsides, and waste areas. Most people recognize musk thistle during the early summer when the plants are actively blooming. However, K-State Rangeland Management Specialist Walt Fick says musk thistle control is easiest as a rosette. He says fall is an excellent time to spray because musk thistle is in the rosette stage of growth. Another advantage for treatment in the fall is reduced risk of off-target drift. Waiting until most deciduous trees have lost their leaves and most crops are harvested will greatly reduce the likelihood of damage from herbicide drift. Fall also provides a wider window of opportunity for treating musk thistle. Fick says the spraying window in the fall probably extends until the ground is frozen and the musk thistle plants have shut down activity until warmer temperatures arrive in the spring. Freezing temperatures will start to damage musk thistle plants with some yellowing and curling of leaves. However, the plants are susceptible to herbicides as long as green tissue exists. If you need to treat musk thistle this fall, Fick says that herbicides exist that will not only control the rosettes at the time of application, but will carry over and control new emerging rosettes next spring. If possible, Fick says to spray musk thistle on a warm, sunny day. Well, a beef commercial was recently featured during a Big 12 conference football game. Kansas Livestock Association Scarlett Hagan says this is just one more way that the Kansas Beef Council is connecting with consumers.
The Kansas Beef Council's newly released One Simple Ingredient commercial was televised in select markets during the highly competitive Kansas State University versus Texas Christian University Big 12 Conference football game on October 10th. The 30-second commercial highlights the positive nutritional attributes of beef and one key area where alternatives cannot compete. Beef has one ingredient, beef. With the combined reach of the broadcast markets and highly targeted advertising on digital sites like YouTube, the campaign has been seen more than 350,000 times since October 1st. According to Kansas Beef Council Director of Communications Scott Stebner, this checkoff-funded beef promotion highlights how the protein provided by beef can help fuel student athletes to reach their full potential. This broadcast opportunity allowed the Kansas Beef Council to take this message to sports-loving families across Kansas. To date, the One Simple Ingredient campaign, which encompasses 2 video spots, has been seen more than 2.5 million times by consumers in Kansas and the Kansas City metro area. Other states also are sharing the campaign, which has increased the overall reach by almost 10 million. You can visit the newly created Beef Hub at kansasbeef.org to learn more about demand-building programs conducted by the Kansas Beef Council. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And finally, in agricultural news, in this week's soybean update, Julie Oman of the Indiana Soybean Alliance has more on Pore Shield. That's a new soy-based concrete durability enhancer.
Julie Oman, new uses consultant for the Indiana Soybean Alliance, joins us. And Julie, ISA and the United Soybean Board recently announced that select Indiana counties had the opportunity to use a new soy-based concrete durability enhancer called Pore Shield. Can you tell us about this new product?
Pore Shield is a soy-based concrete durability enhancer that revolutionized the technology by creating a new category of concrete protection. So Pore Shield works slightly differently than many other concrete protection products. It actually creates a filler for the pores so that it functions for protecting the inside out versus many other film fillers just to protect the surface. So Pore Shield, it actually functions as a replacement for many topical sealers, but well beyond that, it actually protects the concrete, especially in the case we're talking about with bridges that we just did with the Indiana County Association. It protects 10 years, and it creates a barrier for freeze-thaw conditions that cause damage with ice and de-icing salts. This summer, we put this down on 77 bridges in 7 counties. We are seeing amazing results, and we're hearing great feedback from the applicators. Since it's 97% bio-based, it's very economical, and it's good for our environment.
And it's pretty amazing to know how much soybeans are actually used per, say, every 2-mile lane of concrete joint that's treated with Pore Shield.
With every bushel of soybeans, we utilize about 12.4 pounds of that soybean oil, and that gives us around a coverage of application around 200 bushels per 2-lane road of highway, but then also 400 bushels when you're treating bridge surfaces, such as the project you mentioned earlier.
So, freeze-thaw issues like that, I'm sure many states would definitely be interested in that.
We're looking at a pretty large projected usage. If we could get this adopted by every DOT and municipality in the United States, somewhere in the ballpark of 44 million bushels annually is what we would anticipate might happen if we could get that conversion to happen within the next 15 years.
And the partnership with USB just shows what those soybean checkoff dollars are doing.
So we started this project in Indiana 12 years ago, working at the direction of the Indiana DOT. And since we've had some good results in the last 10 years, field studies, we were able to marry up with the United Soybean Board and expand the reach of this. So it's so important, those partnerships. It gives you a greater reach all across the nation.
Julie Uhlman, new uses consultant for the Indiana Soybean Alliance, joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And that's a look at today's agricultural news. Agriculture Today continues after the break with K-State horticulturist Ward Upham. He has tips for planting spring flowering bulbs and controlling broadleaf weeds in lawns. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. In this week's Lawn and Garden segment, we cover when and how to plant spring flowering bulbs, options for controlling broadleaf weeds in lawns, and applying late-season nitrogen in cool-season lawns, such as Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. K-State Research and Extension horticulturist Ward Upham is here to walk us through all of that. Ward, one of the questions you probably get this time of year deals with planting spring flowering bulbs, and there is still time.
There still is time. Actually, October is probably the primary month that you want to get those planted. And actually, if you have to, you can go into mid-November. Another question we sometimes get is people forget about those bulbs, and they want to know if they should hold them over to the next year or plant them when they find them. And regardless, you plant them when you find them. You don't try to hold them. Even if it's in the spring, you plant them. You're not going to get flowers that year, but you do plant them. So, as we said, October is the best month, but you can go to mid-November and still have them bloom well. Those plants need to have a cool, moist period before they're going to flower, and that's what planting them in the fall gives you.
As long as that temperature is above 40 degrees, I'm talking ground temperature.
Right. So 40 degrees is what you need in order to get good root growth, or above. And so you want those roots out there and well established before it gets too cold.
So what do we do then to prepare the bed?
So on the bed, what we want to do is add lots of organic matter if it already hasn't been added. And so a minimum of probably 2 inches to the surface and then mixed in. Or you can go 4 inches and mix it in. Just work it fairly deep because some of those bulbs are going to go relatively deep in that soil. Normally, as far as depth of planting is concerned, we want about 2 to 3 times the depth of that bulb. That's to the bottom of the bulb. And so if you have a bulb that's like 1 inch, you want to put it 3 inches, you dig a hole 3 inches deep, and that's where it sits. It's not to the top of the bulb, it's to the bottom.
Are we going to fertilize at the same time?
Yes, and so you want to make sure you fertilize. Now, it's best if you have a soil test done, but if you don't have time to get that done, just use something that has more phosphorus than either nitrogen or potassium. And so that middle number is going to be larger. So if you have, for example, a 5-10-5, you're going to want about 6 cups of fertilizer. per 100 square feet. Or if you have something like a 10-20-10 or 11-15-11, cut that in half because it's twice as concentrated. So it's going to be 3 cups per 100 square feet. And just mix that into the soil. So what you normally do is you add your organic matter, add your fertilizer, and then you mix it in.
You talked about depth. What about spacing?
Spacing, it just depends on the size of the bulb. There'll be directions on that package normally about how far to put them apart. And you don't want single bulbs. You want to have kind of a mass planting. It makes a much, much better display if you do that.
Yeah, you got to think about how it's going to grow, right?
Yes. And so you're not going to see anything until next spring. Another question you often get, it may come up like in January or February. That's okay. It's not going to hurt a thing. Those plants are very cold tolerant, and you'll be fine if they come up early. The last thing you have to do is water it in. Make sure that those bulbs are moist as they go into the winter.
Another thing that we can start thinking about is controlling broadleaf weeds late October, early November.
That's right. We have what are called winter annual weeds. That includes things like henbit and chickweed, shepherd's purse. There's a number of these. Henbit is probably our number one. And so we want to go with late October, early November to spray those just because they may still be coming up. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to wait for a rain before I spray because I think it's been dry for so long. I'm afraid we're not going to get complete germination and those plants coming up until we get a rain. And then I'm going to be looking at spraying. And you can use a number of things. 2,4-D by itself is fine. But some of those combination products like Weed Be Gone, Weed Out, anything that is for broadleaf weeds should do a really good job on these.
And we're looking at controlling those dandelions primarily, it seems like.
Yeah, dandelions, actually, most of those come up in the fall. Most people think they come up in the spring, but they don't. Usually about the 3rd or last week in September is when you get a big new flush of those, but they're small plants. And they are easy to control in the fall. But for all of our winter annual weeds as well as dandelions, those plants are moving all the materials from the top part of the plant down to the roots. So if you spray them in the fall, you're actually moving that herbicide down to the roots and you're killing it from the bottom up. Much better control in the fall than you will in the spring. So just make sure you wait long enough to allow that henbit and chickweed and all those winter annuals to come up before you spray. You'll get a really good job.
And you're looking for a day that's at least above 50.
Yeah, 50 will give you actually a quicker response, but really down to 40, you're going to get control. And so it's just going to be a slower type process, but usually I try to look for a day that's 50 degrees or over.
Also want to talk about applying a late-season nitrogen application in November.
Yeah, and this is for our cool-season grasses. And so that's going to be Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue, not Bermuda, zoysia, or buffalo. Those are warm-season grasses. They don't need to be fertilized now. But Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue do. What we're looking for here is be late enough that you're not getting any more top growth, but those roots are still active. And so usually early November is a good time to put that down. Make sure you get watered in. It'll be taken up by that plant. And what you're going to see is about a week's earlier green up next spring. Those plants take up that nitrogen and they store it over winter so that you can not only get that earlier green up, but you don't have to add another fertilizer application in early spring, let's say in March or April. When you do that, when you fertilize in early spring, you often get a lot of top growth that just increases how much mowing you have to do. Now, you will have to fertilize probably in early May in order to carry those plants through the summer if they are irrigated. If they're not, they often go dormant and you don't need that fertilization. But if it's irrigated, then yes, you're going to need another fertilization in early May.
These cool season grasses, what's the application rate?
So usually looking at about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of actual nitrogen, not fertilizer, but actual nitrogen. Just follow the directions on the bag. Get a lawn fertilizer that is made for fall application. And if you follow directions on the bag, that's going to give you the correct amount.
And this is a slow release then?
This is actually a quick release.
Okay.
So in the summer, that early May application, you do want slow release, so it's released gradually over time. But in this time of year, you want it released quickly, so it's taken up quickly as those roots are active, because they're going to become inactive as it gets colder.
And this will also help with weed control later on.
It will, because that's going to thicken up that lawn so that you have less sunlight hitting the soil. A lot of our weed seeds have to have sunlight in order to germinate. You have a good thick lawn, you usually don't have near as much of a weed problem.
You have a lot of information available online. How can they find that?
So the easiest way to find that is do a search. Do a search on Horticulture Information Center, Kansas. That brings up a page that leads to everything that we have. We have our common plant problems there. We have our newsletter there. We have what plants are recommended for Kansas. Just a lot of information brought together in one place. And not only from us, but also from plant pathology and entomology, Kansas Forest Service. We try to bring everything together in one place.
That's K-State Research and Extension horticulturist Ward Upham with advice for planting spring flowering bulbs, controlling broadleaf weeds in lawns, and applying late-season nitrogen to cool-season lawns. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.